So suppose you ask, well, can animals be moral? As I once did, and I wrote a book about it, and the spoiler alert, yes, they can. The clearest argument you can give for extending moral consideration beyond humans appeals to sentience. When my father was a kid, he had a German shepherd called Rex, of whom he was very fond, and he used to ride around the garden on his back. The Rowlands family at this time also had a pig. My father was very fond of the pig, and he used to ride around the garden on his back. Rex lived a long and happy life, and things went, rather differently for the pig. And so, there was a general realization that something is not right here. We have no hope unless we fundamentally change the way we interact with animals. In particular, we can't afford to eat them anymore.
Good morning, Marc. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Jamie. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, it's a pleasure to get to talk to you. I just finished reading your new book, The Word of Dog, this morning, and it's a wonderful read. So it's great timing for me to get the chance to talk to you. But I've followed your work as an amateur for quite a while, and you've written on so many themes that are absolutely central to this sentientism idea, philosophy of mind. What are sentience and consciousness? Obviously, the big questions of moral philosophy, particularly how it relates to non-human animals, and the meaning of life too. So your thinking fits beautifully into the themes we like to cover here. So it's great to get you on as a guest.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the kind words. I appreciate them.
And we've got a few links to my previous guests as well. So I was lucky to interview Frans before he sadly passed away. I've interviewed Jessica Pearce, Marc Bekoff, and another gentleman whose work I'm sure you will have come across, of Michael Hauskeller.
Oh, yeah, I know Michael.
Yeah,
wow.
Who's also written about, the meaning of life in the context of non-human animals too. So they're all previous guests. So that's sort of framed some of the way I think about these topics. I've explained briefly, but I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions, and ones that are oddly somewhat neglected, or the answers are assumed. And they're, I guess, the deep questions of what's real, how do we understand the universe, the questions of epistemology, and just as importantly, the questions of ethics, but particularly the question of moral scope. Who gets to count in our moral consideration, whichever system we use. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize sentientism as a really broad, pluralistic worldview, if you like, that when it comes to the what's real question says, we're not going to tell you what to believe, but we should at least use a broad, humble, naturalistic epistemology, use evidence and reason to understand reality as far as we can. And on the ethical side, again, it's pretty pluralistic in terms of the system, but it does insist that at least every sentient being should get to matter and should matter seriously in our moral consideration. So I summarize it as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings as a sort of sentence summary of the worldview. But I'm lucky in these conversations to talk to a dazzling variety of different minds, and many of them disagree with different aspects of sentientism too. So it would be great to understand your own philosophical journey and how that plays into your work. But before we get into those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who aren't familiar with your work?
Well, my name is Marc Rowlands. I'm a professor and chair of philosophy at the University of Miami. I've written quite a lot of books, so in 20 something now. And I have had various different hats. I mean, some of the books are about the mind, where it is, what sort of thing it is. But a lot of my books have been about moral consideration and what sort of things we owe moral consideration to: animals, the environment, that sort of thing. So basically, I've written a lot in the area of animal ethics, and lately, I suppose my work has been going into kind of strange areas that philosophers stopped talking about for a while, but I think there's been a kind of welcome resurgence in some of these questions about the meaning of life broadly construed. What's life? What's important in it? How should we live in a broader sense than the purely moral? So the latest book that you kindly mentioned, The Word of Dog, that was an exploration of the idea of meaning in life. Through the lens provided by a series of dogs, with whom I've been fortunate enough to spend many years.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And one technical issue we might have in this recording is I've also been joined by companion Luna, who's decided that she's not happy sitting downstairs and she's not happy sitting on the sofa next to me. She has to be on my lap. So at the moment she's chilling out and listening in, but She may demand something later on, so we'll see how it goes.
Well, if someone has the audacity to walk past the front of our house, then you'll hear a cacophony of barking in the background.
Yeah, non-human guests are very welcome.
Good. I'll try and get Shadow along later. I don't know where he is. My son is around, so he's just following him from room to room.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So let's start with the first of these crazily broad, deep questions, the question of what's real. And it is such a big question because it affects every field of possible belief or credence we might have, and every question you want to look in, any question of facts anyway. But quite often a good way into it, my guests, in terms of their philosophical journey, is how they were brought up, and were they brought up in a context that was maybe more spiritual or religious or supernaturally influenced in its thinking, or one that was maybe more naturalistic and scientific and in its context, and how that side of their thinking, not so much about what you believe, but how do you go about believing? How has that changed over your life? So you can wind the clock back as far as you're comfortable to sort of tell the story of your epistemological journey.
Yeah, I don't know if my epistemological journey started when I was a kid. Probably not, but who knows? We weren't a religious family in the sense that I never went to church ever, or anything like that. My mother's father was an Anglican vicar, and I think that just kind of put her off formal religion. So basically, I was raised without any sort of religious background or context, really.
Yeah. And as you grew up and you encountered those sorts of ideas and people who believed in those things, what was your response to it? Were you intrigued, drawn in, tempted, or did you see them as relevant or interesting in a particular way?
No, I mean, you're talking about religious beliefs? No,
yeah.
I thought them. I mean,
or even more broadly, spiritual beliefs or some sense of the transcendent, or can go in lots of different ways. Something beyond.
Yeah. I suppose the younger me was sort of, hostile, maybe the right word. I don't know. I just didn't buy it. So I was certainly, when I was, a teenager, early 20s, I was just a sort of firm dyed-in-the-wool naturalist. We're just physical organisms. When we die, you're dead, you're dead. That kind of standard naturalistic line.
Yeah, makes sense. And presumably, and would you still describe yourself that way now, or have there been aspects of your thinking that have been, been tempted to go either beyond a naturalistic method, or being open-minded about the possibility of something supernatural, if such things are even conceivable to you?
Well, no.
Or are you like me, a sort of boring straight down the line, naturalistic epistemology, and that's it? So,
well. This pertains, to the question of what's real. So I've come to the view that real is ambiguous, and there are two different perspectives we humans have on life, and one is a perspective from the outside. And so, when you look at yourself from the outside, you and me, we're just sort of standard people. There's nothing particularly special about either of us. We do our thing, whatever it is, and then and then eventually we die, and our deaths are no different in kind from the deaths of billions of other human beings. That's just the way things go. So, looked at from the outside, then I'm just an unremarkable being in an unremarkable world who lives an unremarkable life, and so on and so on. But there's also a view from the inside, and this featured, this is featured quite prominently, I suppose, in recent work, including the book you've just read. And from the inside, our lives are kind of hubs of meaning and purpose. What we matter. What we want matters, and it matters deeply to us. And it was Thomas Nagel, a very good philosopher, who a long time ago, I think it was 50 years or so now, that's how quickly time passes, wrote a very good paper called The Absurd, in which he said, well, this is the human predicament. We have these two different views of reality, and we know they both can't be true because they're incompatible, but we can't bring ourselves to get rid of either one of them. And so our existence is in this sense absurd. It doesn't make sense. And I think there's a lot to that. I mean,
Yeah. And is it absurd in both senses? It's absurd in the sense of there's this contradiction between the sort of impersonal view that we are nothing special, but our personal view that our lives are imbued with meaning. So there's a meaning clash there. But is there also an epistemological clash where, there's probably an objective reality out there, but then, in a sense, all I ever experience, however real or unreal it is, an aspect of my own mentality? Is that an aspect of the contradiction as well? Do they relate?
So yeah, that's exactly the right question. So if you accept that there is these two different views, right, that we can adopt on our lives, then the question is, well, where do we start attaching the word real? Why attach it to these views rather than the other? There's a beautiful quote from Wittgenstein, I think, which captures the idea of the view from the inside very nicely. And he says, our lives have no limit in the sense that our visual field has no limit. So the point is that any limits from the inside, the visual field has no limit because any limits can't be visible. Otherwise, they wouldn't be limits. They'd just be part of the visual field. Viewed from the inside, our life is a strange thing. We find it very difficult to understand the idea of death. And we find it very difficult to understand the idea of an end, but we know that there is an end, and so which is the more real? Is sort of the basic question. Is it the view from the outside? We can understand the idea of a visual field from the outside. If you're looking at an organism, if you understand how its eyes work, then you can pretty much work out where the visual field begins and ends. That's the view inside, but from the inside is very, very different. And Wittgenstein's point was the same is true of life. We understand from the outside that life has a beginning, it has an end, and the end is inevitable. But from the inside, we find that very difficult to understand. And I think the question is, well, okay, let's accept for the sake of argument that there are these two different views. To which do we want to attach the word real? Which is it more? If any, is it more legitimate to attach the label real to, and it's not clear that there's a straightforward answer that isn't already grounded in presuppositions or prejudices that you bring to the discussion. So if you're a dyed-in-the-wool naturalist, the younger me would certainly be a dyed-in-the-wool naturalist. Well, it's the view from the outside, that's real. But it's not really clear to me, once you chip away at the presuppositions and prejudices, it's not really clear why that has to be so, that the view from the outside is more real than the one from the inside.
Yeah. So your dyed-in-the-wool naturalist stance is being sort of chipped away and undermined by this sense of the subjective and how that plays in. Yeah. And is there, and I guess because I think I'm still a sort of dyed-in-the-wool naturalist. And the way I try and resolve those things, and I don't know if this works, is that I do think my own subjective perspective is real in a sense, but I also think my subjective perspective is part of objective reality as well. So it just has a particular character of, particular viewpoint, but it is still ultimately, partly also because of my philosophy of mind, still just part of the same objective reality. So when I imagine a unicorn, that pattern of neural firings or chemical wave patterns or whatever it is, that pattern is real. So in a sense, that imagination of the unicorn is real. But that's very different from whether there are actually unicorns outside. So I don't know if that helps to, is there a resolution along that path, or am I missing something fundamental?
I think that move always requires tacitly bringing the view from the outside to the view from the inside and saying, okay,
and sort of forcing it onto it.
Yeah. So, I mean, a supernatural answer would be a cloud. So you start appealing to spirits and strange things like that. That would be a classic example of bringing a view from the outside to the inside and saying, oh, this is what's going on. There are various non-physical entities here, and that's why the view from the inside is so special, But I don't think that's a legitimate move either. I think the view from the inside is very, very mysterious. in a way that the supernatural is not. The supernatural is mundane, really. Well, okay, there were these. Perhaps everything's physical, as the naturalist says. Perhaps there are these non-physical entities, as the supernaturalist says. That seems to be, to me, to be a sort of mundane. You're working from within the same framework. Okay, here's this reality. We're aware of it. Either it's physical, or parts of it are non-physical. That's the view from the outside. It's not. We haven't got to the view from the inside yet.
So the real mystery, the really interesting question, is that one of the subjective and
yeah. And when we ask questions like, well, how does consciousness produce this view from the inside? Again, that is bringing a view from the outside. You're framing it as, well, you've got these brain processes, and you've got this consciousness that they somehow produce, but that is making consciousness into an object of your awareness and your inquiry, and asking how this strange object comes from this slightly more mundane object that is the brain. I think that philosophers, I think Sartre was very good on this, actually. And, Sartre good on something is not something that many philosophers say anymore, but I think he was an excellent philosopher. And he said, look, there are basically, you can understand consciousness in two ways. There's consciousness as object. And in contemporary philosophy, certainly as it's practiced in the Anglo-American world, that's the way we think of consciousness. We say, well, how can this is, I think it was Peirce, really, how can this be produced by this stuff going on in the brain, And that's to think of, well, there's one object and it's a bit strange, and we don't understand how it's produced by another object, brain processes. I'm using object broadly enough to include things like events and processes. Basically, an object is an actual or potential object of awareness. So we can be aware in principle of brain processes. We hook someone up to an MRI, for example. We can be aware of our consciousness. That seems undeniable. So we have two objects, and our problem is understanding how one object can produce or explain the other. And that's what the hard problem of consciousness is. I mean, if Sartre's right, there's a much harder problem than that, and that is pertaining to consciousness as lived. Where consciousness as lived is not an object of awareness at all. It's something else entirely. And what it fundamentally is, consciousness as lived, is extrapolating behind what Sartre actually says. I think you end up with this view. Consciousness as lived is revealing activity. It's that which reveals the world as being a certain way. So when I'm looking at my trusty can of Diet Coke here, then the world, a little bit of the world, this part of the world here, is revealed to me as being a can of Diet Coke. My consciousness as lived is that in virtue of which this can is revealed to me in this way.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Now, this might seem a slightly strange diversion, but I think given the word of dog, it works. You mentioned, you're not sure you had much of an epistemology as a kid. And I think that's quite a common way of thinking about it. I mean, I wasn't doing philosophy as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old. And people might apply that to non-human animals as well. I mean, the idea of non-human animals having an epistemology can seem pretty alien, because it does seem like it's something you require a certain, style of cognition or reflection to have. But there's another way of looking at it, and I quite often run workshops in schools about different types of worldviews. And when I'm talking about sentientism, I'll explain that it's quite a new word and a new worldview, but it's based on some really ancient ideas. And maybe this idea of naturalism, of trying to, with humility, understand the world as it is, using information from reality, using evidence and reason, is actually as old as humanity. Even the earliest humans, before we were writing philosophy papers, in a way were using their senses to try and understand the world and building representations and just to try and survive. And along those lines, then, maybe non-human animals, even before humans, in a sense, were using a naturalistic epistemology in its roughest sense to try and understand reality, because it was evolutionary adaptive to have a basic understanding of reality, which would then lead you to say, well, maybe Luna here or Shadow, in a sense, might have an epistemology. How has your thinking and your experience of life with dogs led you to think about their form of epistemology, if it's even appropriate to use that word? How do they come to know reality? And
yeah, okay, no, good, I like that. So I'm tempted by the Wittgenstein view, right? That we're all philosophers, whether we picked up a book of philosophy or not, picked up a book of philosophy or not. We're all philosophers, whether we realize it or not. And this is because in our lives, we bring to bear on daily occurrences, like we bring to bear various philosophical assumptions and principles. So that the young kid who's feeling guilty, thinking, "Oh, perhaps I should have done otherwise," is bringing to bear a philosophical assumption about the nature of free will. And I think it's inevitable that we do this sort of thing. The thing about dogs is that I don't know if we'd understand the philosophical assumptions. If they could talk, well, I'm going to say again, Wittgenstein is creeping in a lot. I'm not sure why that is, but if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand him, that kind of thing. Could we understand the philosophical assumptions dogs make? I'm not sure. The reason I think they're useful, and the reason I sort of wrote the book, was because I think whether or not we understand their philosophical assumptions, they can point the way to solving philosophical problems for us, even though they have no idea that these problems exist. So perhaps, again, Wittgenstein, perhaps it's because perhaps it's because the disease model of philosophy is right. Perhaps philosophers get, perhaps dogs get parvo and humans get philosophy, and parvo is much more serious. You should take it much more seriously, philosophy. But it may be that there are certain sort of issues, certain problems, anxieties, and so on that arise for us, and they don't arise for a creature like a dog. And understanding why they don't arise for a creature like a dog can help us with the anxiety or the problem as it applies to us. That's the basic idea behind the book, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things I found interesting is that one of the things you're doing in the book is challenging the idea of reflection. And reflection is something that we as humans, see that we think it sets us apart from the non-human animal world in ways that probably aren't appropriate. But we often see it as an unalloyed good. And I think people will often see that in the epistemological space. I describe it as using evidence and reasoning by itself is some form of a reflective. So I think people might find it interesting that you're almost making the suggestion that maybe reflection isn't always a good idea, not just in the sense of, meaning and how to live a fulfilled life, but maybe even isn't always the right thing to do in an epistemological sense. And just intuitively, I can sort of see some pull of that, because there are certain situations where I do see humans, overthinking, and the classic examples might be conspiracism or people doing their own research, or, one thought too many, where their reflection has literally led them astray. Maybe a more grounded, basic, less reflective approach would give them a better appreciation of reality. But at the same time, I'm worried about going too far the other way and giving up on reflection, because, we know that not being reflective enough can lead people into, either accepting or following through on really broken forms of epistemology that lead them to fundamentally understand the world, often in harmful ways. So how in an epistemological sense, how much is the right amount of reflection, and how much can we learn from shadow and dogs and non-human animals about how to get that balance right?
Yeah, I think it's a deeply context-sensitive question. In certain circumstances, we should do certain things, and in other circumstances, not. I mean, to be clear, reflection is a fantastic capacity which has done wonders for us as a species. Part of what I was getting at in the book was that existence is always a game of swings and roundabouts. So whenever you gain something from a certain development, there are always associated losses. So I was concerned, since there's no shortage of people who are willing to extol the virtues of humanity, I just wanted to sort of explore those losses a little in the book. And the fundamental loss was that reflection makes us troubled creatures in a way that dogs and other animals are not. And a troubled creature is a creature that has troubled mental states. So take a belief, for example. Dogs believe things, and sometimes those things are true, and sometimes those things are false. So when I take Shadow out on the canal, he may believe that a certain palm tree frond that's lying in the grass in a certain way is an iguana, which he loves to chase. Right. So he has a belief there's an iguana in front of me. He'll go into stalking mode and then he'll charge, and the frond obviously doesn't move, and so his belief changes. Oh, it wasn't an iguana after all. I mean, there are all sorts of interesting issues about what exactly dogs believe, but we'll ignore those for the sake of the now anyway. And so the world, various things can happen in the world, and dogs can change their beliefs on the basis of that. But we take this to a different kind of level. You know, we can kill our beliefs on our own. So as soon as we have a belief, we'll start worrying about it. We'll start fretting. Oh, I believe this, but should I believe it? Do I have enough evidence? Is there any countervailing evidence that might point us me in a different direction? You know, do other people believe?
And in a way and that humility and doubt is absolutely seen as an essential part of a good, healthy, naturalistic worldview, right? You don't want to be trapped in a dogma, literally a dogma, right? Yes, of course.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. So paradoxically, or seemingly paradoxically, you know, we have this healthy approach to belief formation, which at the same time condemns us to being a certain sort of creature that's troubled in a way that dogs are not. So again, Sartre, I think, made this point. I say, a belief is never simply a belief. By its nature, a belief is always a troubled belief, and he was talking about human beliefs.
Yeah. Whereas Shadow updates his belief based on the evidence, but he doesn't freak out about it. It just like switches, and that's it, and on we go. Yeah.
If the evidence comes in, fine, but he's not going to go out of his way to start working through evidence. Yeah, and that's why we're better than him, but also in another way, that's why he's better than us. That's. Thank
you. So it's not. You're not saying get rid of reflection completely and let's become more dog, but you just want us to recognize the trade-offs and what we might be losing in.
Yes. So in this case, the idea would be, okay, maybe in certain circumstances, not all the time, because as I say, well, first of all, we're not dogs and we can never be dogs, and so reflection is our lot. We can't be something that we're not. Maybe there are certain circumstances, we could put it this way, when we just need to lighten up a little and not worry so much about things. And this crops up more in connection with questions about how to live rather than how to believe. But the same general principle, I think, is.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's move on to the second big question, which is the question about what matters. So again, I'm interested in your sort of personal philosophical journey about how you came to think about the basics of ethics. So my guess, you've had a religious upbringing, often that was quite a strong influence. Those without a religious upbringing, had found different, societal and familial inputs as well as our evolutionary stuff. But there's so many different ways of thinking about, what do good and bad and right and wrong mean, and if there are such things as moral foundations, what's really at the root. So what was your sort of personal story working through that stuff, again, even as from as a kid and to now?
I suppose morally, my beliefs were shaped significantly by Peter Singer's book Animal Liberation, which is now over 50 years old, or 50 years old this year, I think.
And he's republished, he's published a rewritten version recently. I was lucky enough to interview him a while ago about it. So.
Right, okay. Yeah, I've not read it yet, but is it significantly different from the original?
Yeah, I mean, philosophically, I don't think there's a radical change in there at all, but it's, the facts and the figures and the context is updated. So it's, he definitely frames it as a new effort rather than just a tweak here and there.
Right.
And I think there's some shift in his philosophy, but they're a little more around the edges rather than anything to its core. But
yeah, I mean, one of the striking features of Animal Liberation was that his utilitarianism was fairly muted. I mean, the main argument was this argument from equal consideration of interests, and I think that was the part of the argument that appealed to me at that time. If you're going to consider different interests differently, the interests had by you and by me, if I'm going to consider those interests differently, then there must be some morally relevant difference between my interests and yours that could allow me to say accord greater weight to my interests. And then the argument is, well, there is no morally relevant difference, and therefore your interests count as much as mine. And then the case for animal ethics is basically an extension of that sort of general idea. I think it's a very powerful idea, really powerful. It persuaded me. I mean, I've noticed over the years that a lot of people resist. They think it must be something wrong with this idea that there are no morally relevant differences between humans and other animals. And so I've sort of looked in other directions to kind of supplement really this principle of equal consideration of interests.
Yeah, and I find that compelling as well, and actually more compelling than his sort of more pure utilitarian stance. Because one of the challenges to Peter and his thinking, you can almost summarize it by saying, well, your utilitarianism doesn't quite live up to the radical call of the title, right? It's not really about animal liberation, and it's not about animal rights. Really, it's about an outside-in assessment of the quality of their experiences, which may not actually completely accord with their interests. So when you talk about, a non-human animal or a human animal having an interest in continuing to live a long, happy life with their family, there are some utilitarian versions that will say, well, I don't really count that interest as valid. All I care is about the momentary experience of suffering they might be having. So that can lead you to see, painless killing as, essentially not a morally wrong act, because, and so I shouldn't go on to that too long, but like you, I found the idea of consideration of the interests of another, a broader and a deeper moral pull than a sort of more technical, narrow utilitarian.
Yes,
I'm going to assess your suffering from the outside and take judgments on your behalf. But
no, that's exactly right. I mean, what you've got in that book is, well, what you've got in Singer's work more generally. There's a meta-ethical principle, not an ethical principle as such, but a principle about ethical principles that all interests should be considered equally. All relevant interests should be considered equally, unless there's some morally relevant difference between whoever has the interest. So that's this sort of meta-ethical. Now, his utilitarianism is a way of interpreting this idea of equal consideration of interests. So, okay, you say all interests should be considered equally. What does that mean? In steps the utilitarian and says, well, what that means is that all interests should be, all desires should be thrown into a pot, and whatever comes out on top is, so equal consideration of interests is understood in terms of aggregation of desires or preferences. I didn't follow Singer in that direction. I think the equal consideration is a good one. I'm not at all sure about. I mean, I have an eclectic view of Marc, because I'm not sure which, if any, is the one true moral theory. Maybe it's utilitarianism. Maybe it's something more deontologically inspired, like Reagan's account. I mean, in my kind of early work, I was focused a lot on contractualism or contractarianism, not because I'm a contractualist, or though a lot of people assumed I was, but because that was the one moral view that seemed to make the case for animal rights very difficult. So according to contractualism, in order to have rights, you have to be the sort of creature. Well, according to contractualism, as it's usually understood, in order to have rights, you have to be the sort of creature who can make and abide by agreements with others.
Yeah. So young humans are out, for example. But
that's a standard objection, to contractualism, is that the people who really seem to need some help are the ones who get messed up, others. So I was concerned with developing more plausible accounts of contractualism that didn't have this sort of implication, both for the case of animals and because and because of the case of these sort of these humans who also get excluded. In each case, what we have is basically a meta-ethical principle. All interests should be considered equally, roughly. And then we have these different articulations or interpretations of what that principle means. There's a utilitarian interpretation, there's a deontological interpretation, a contractualist interpretation, so on and so on. So I find the meta-ethical principle, the main problem, I find it very convincing, all right, but I did notice as the years passed that many people, not just not just, probably not even primarily professional philosophers, but the public found this idea very difficult to swallow, that there were no moral, because the basic idea is that all interests should be considered equally unless there's some morally relevant difference between humans and non-human animals. So many people find this idea that there's no moral difference between us and them, as they might put it, to be very implausible. So while I think the argument is in fact impeccable, I also noticed that it didn't attain the widespread satisfaction that it should logically.
And I find it fascinating because, again, I'm very much an amateur on looking in from the outside on this field, but it seems like the vast majority of moral philosophy content, whether it's in public intellectuals, whether it's in philosophy papers, whether it's in books, almost deliberately avoids that moral scope question because of this issue. So there's a default, often background assumption that only humans matter. And now I will expound, my view of, Kantian ethic or a virtue ethic or a feminist care ethic or whatever it might be. And now let's go into all of these different ethical systems. But they've already assumed a moral scope that I think has made a fundamental and terrible error that renders most of their ethical thinking, you've almost destroyed it. Because what's the point of having a great ethical system if you've excluded most of the valid moral patients? Whereas there's a different approach, which I think is the one that you took, which I think is the more intellectually honest one, which is whatever ethical system you consider, I've yet to find a reason why that ethical system doesn't very intuitively and naturally extend beyond humanity. So if you're thinking about rights to protect interests, well, you can follow that through, as Christine Korsgaard has done, for example, of taking that sort of Kantian approach of ends in themselves, right? Well, if a human is an end in themselves, then so are many non-human animals. You can take a feminist care ethic and go, well, most humans already do care beyond the species boundary, so why can't we extend that care obligation in the relations we have beyond humanity? Utilitarianism, generally does it pretty naturally already, right? Because there's well-being and humans aren't the only ones. So I find it very strange that, whichever ethical approach you take, and I like quite a pluralistic approach, I've yet to find an intellectually coherent way of restricting it to humans, which is why so many people just assume that the answer to that question and, crack on regardless. So in this weird sense, that fundamental question of who matters, the moral scope, seems to be deeply neglected in the field of moral philosophy. And it's like, well, how can you... the book, I've got a book downstairs by David Wiggins called Ethics, right? And it's 600 pages long. And the word animal is not even in the index, right? It's just not a question. Anyway, I should stop ranting because I'm supposed to be...
No, you're right. I mean, I think part of the power of the idea of equal consideration is that the seeds of the extension of this principle are sort of part of the content of the principle itself. So what does equal consideration mean? Well, we start with me. I count, right? My desires matter, right? But then
almost definitionally, right? It's
yeah. I mean, so that's right. So this is a standard way of thinking about it. Well, I matter, but then I have to acknowledge that well, you're pretty much like me, So if I matter, then it's very likely that you matter too. Right. I may not like it, but logically I'm kind of, I have to accept through gritted teeth, if you like, that it's true. And so, and then the same is true of all humans. So you started with yourself and then you've basically expanded to many, if not all, sort of humans. Right. The extension to animals. So why do all these matter? Well, because I matter and there's no morally relevant difference between me and other human beings. The extension to animals is just part of this overall kind of, dialectic or argument that, well, there are no morally relevant differences between many non-human animals and humans. How do we know this? Well, we run a certain type of argument. It used to be called, we're not allowed to call it what it used to be called, but it is now called the argument from species overlap. Basically, you say, well, what's the morally relevant difference between humans and non-human animals? Well, the difference is, let's suppose, intelligence. But then you point to the fact that in the case of some humans, those, say, suffering from severe brain damage or brain degeneration or something, are not more intelligent than many animals. So we have a choice. Either we demote these humans and treat them the way we currently treat animals, or we promote animals and treat them the way we treat these humans. And so in the end, the idea is that there's no morally relevant difference between humans and non-human animals that could underwrite a moral difference, a difference in the consideration we owe them, morally speaking. So, I mean, the argument, as I say, I think is logically impeccable, but it fails to convince lots of people. So I started in more recent years to look at various ways of building an animal ethics which wasn't based on this principle of equal consideration. Not because I think it's wrong, but because I think it is not as efficacious as is desirable, really.
Yeah. And is that, because you've written extensively on animal rights specifically as well, is that one of the ways you think we could shore that stance up? Or
I think that there's a much less controversial principle that many people will adopt, because it's something you kind of you teach to children when they're young, when they're asking for too many things. So you get them to distinguish between what they need and what they want, right? And this distinction between needs and wants is it's like it tracks a distinction between what we might think of as crucial or vital interests and non-vital interests. So what you need are vital interests, what you simply want are non-vital interests. And one way of building an animal ethics without appeal to the idea of equal consideration is just say, well, look, whenever you have a case of humans and animals and there's a clash of interests, then you can allow that the vital interests of humans always trump the vital interests of non-human animals. You can allow that the non-vital interests of humans always trump the non-vital interests of non-human animals. But what you can't allow is that the non-vital interests of humans trump the vital interests of animals, because that, in effect, is treating them as if they don't count, morally speaking. It's like if someone decides to kidnap you and harvest your kidneys because they want to sell them on the black market to buy a Ferrari. They're treating you as if you don't count, morally speaking. So they're placing their non-vital interests in owning a Ferrari over your vital interest of having functioning kidneys, right? And that whenever we do that, we're essentially treating someone as if they don't count, morally speaking. So if animals,
you might as well not have moral consideration if someone's going to treat you that way, right?
Yeah, I mean,
it's almost like setting a baseline for the meaning of the words compassion, care, or moral consideration or moral status to mean anything, right?
That's exactly my point. Yeah, she put it much better. That's exactly what I mean. If the kidney thief tries to convince you that he does think you count morally, then that's just a sham.
Yeah, and I don't know how closely it relates to the idea of non-maleficence, which I sometimes also describe as sort of baseline for these concepts to mean anything. In that, I wouldn't needlessly exploit, harm, or kill you, right? Otherwise, what does compassion or care or moral consideration even mean if I'm willing to needlessly? Yeah. Right. So again, I guess that is a similar way of talking about, my non-vital interest, something I don't really need, overriding, vital interests of others. Yeah. I've come to think that's another neglected question, and one that's deeply important, because particularly in the sphere of non-human animal ethics, because very many people will claim they have a naturalistic epistemology. They will claim they have a sentiocentric moral scope that does care about all beings that can have the capacity to suffer. And yet, because they don't pay attention to that minimal baseline, that still allows them to engage in what I see of as egregiously immoral acts towards other sentient beings. And you're like, well, because they haven't understood the implications of what moral consideration or compassion or moral status should actually mean in practical terms. So I've almost come to believe that sort of third tenet of there has to be a practical baseline here needs emphasizing almost as much as the sentiocentric moral scope and as much as the naturalism, right? You've got to say, what's the point of having a moral stance if you don't do anything about it, right? If you don't express it in some way? But
yeah, because I mean, everyone, pretty much everyone, a few psychopaths aside, are going to accept that animals count morally to some extent. It may not be the same as humans in their view, but Everyone. So it's one thing to take a chainsaw to a living tree. It may be regrettable in a variety for various reasons, but it's quite another thing to take a chainsaw to a living dog, for example. So if you accept that, then you accept that there's some dogs exist morally in the sense that they have some kind of moral status. But whenever you override the vital interest of something in order to further the non-vital interest of something else, whether it's you or someone else, then you basically treat them as if they don't count morally. And as a basic definitional principle, it's wrong, morally speaking, to treat something that counts morally as if it doesn't count morally. And so it's wrong to. And I think from that basic idea, you can get most of the kind of prohibitions against treating animals the way we do. I mean, eating animals for food is almost certainly involves a violation of their most vital interests. You know, they live horrific lives, die horrific deaths. For in essence, pleasures of the palate on our part. We don't need to eat the food. It's not a want. It's not a need. It's a want.
Yeah, and social norm compliance and all the other things we think of. But yeah.
So and also you can extend it to animal research as well, because most of that just is ineffective.
Yeah.
So
and you, in a way, you've perfectly demonstrated what we're talking about by collapse. So I sometimes ask these questions separately, you know, what matters and then who matters. And I agree with you in the sense the way you've answered the question is you cannot and you should not separate those questions, right? I mean, they are intrinsically and deeply linked together in a way. But I'm interested in what was your journey on the moral scope question, because like everybody else, I'm assuming you grew up in a, you know, family and society and context that would claim compassion for non-human animals, but just does not act in that way in practical terms. So what was your journey through, you know, I guess the scope of your moral, you know, thinking expanding, and what was the dynamic practically for you? Was that a tough transition or a difficult one, or was it a light bulb moment, or?
Sort of possibly a dim light bulb moment where there's something not right. So I think my first acquaintance with the idea of animal rights came through a story my father told me. You know, when my father was a kid, he had a German Shepherd called Rex, of whom he was very fond, and he used to ride around the garden on his back. The Rowlands family at this time also had a pig. I don't know if the pig was ever named, but I don't know what it was. And my father was very fond of the pig, and he used to ride around the garden on his back. Rex lived a long and happy life, and things went, you know, rather differently for the pig. And so in that story, you know, there was a general realization that something is not right here. And I was very young, so I couldn't work out what was not right, but there was something fishy about the story, something that didn't add up.
Yeah. So one was being treated as a, you know, a him or a her, and the other one was ultimately being treated as an it.
Yeah, and it that was slaughtered for food. Yeah. So who therefore didn't live a long and happy life and didn't die a pleasant death there.
And what was the journey like between that dim light bulb going on and, you know, how hard or difficult was it for you to, you know, build the implications of that into your own life, given family and friends and society? Again, was that, because some of my guests, let me put this positively, right? They're the wonderful sort of weird people where a light goes on and they just say, I'm now changing, you know, I'm what I buy, what I support, you know, what I boycott, and that's it. And yes, there might be social friction, but I'm sort of either going to push through it or just ignore it or tell people to fuck off, deal with it. Right? So they're those weird people where a light goes on and they just act. You know, I was never one of those people. My journey towards, you know, veganism now, which I don't see as some sort of perfect endpoint, but at least it's a stance of boycotting the things I have a philosophical objection to, you know, took ultimately decades, right? Even though my fundamental thinking probably hasn't really changed that much. It's just taken me this long to sort of work through all the social stuff. But
yeah, no, I mean, when this dim light bulb went on, I can't remember exactly how old I was, but I was probably somewhere around about five years old. So I didn't have a lot of sort of agency, you know, at the time to, right, that's it, we're all going vegan, you know. So that it's just that when I encountered this idea later, when I was at university and I started to come across these ideas again, you know, this story of my father always used to pop into my head, you know. And so by then, By the time I was in my early 20s, I could have a little bit more of a say in what I ate when I came home for holidays and stuff, you know.
Yeah, makes sense. And again, that's quite a common story. A lot of people had that sort of reasonably early childhood sort of realization. You know, another one that people tell is when they realize that the word for the chicken on their plate is the same for the animal, and they're like, hold on, yeah. But for most people, one that's just squashed out of their own thinking because of their own psychology and social norm compliance and family and so on. For others, it's sort of buried and then, you know, gets freed up again later when they get to college or university or somewhere else where they've got a bit more of their own agency and it comes back. So yeah, it's an interesting story. Thank you. Here's another slightly weird version of this question, but again, one I found fascinating on your book, which is the other thing I say when I'm talking to kids about the sentientism worldview and its ancient ideas. I say, well, the other side of it is this sentiocentric compassion or moral consideration that goes way beyond humanity. And you can trace that back through human history in loads of different cultures, right? It's not something that Peter Singer or Tom Reagan or someone else made up. You have the idea of ahimsa in the Dharmic religions. You have ideas running through some bits of Rastafarian philosophy, in Chinese philosophy and ancient Greek philosophy. You know, you find these ideas running back. And again, at least in some sort of proto-morality sense, even the earliest humans, I think one, you know, had felt compassion for each other in terms of family groups or maybe broader groups too. But I would bet money that even the earliest humans, even though some of their life depended on, you know, hunting non-human animals, also did have a sense that there was a being there, right, that mattered in their own right. In the same way I can look into Luna's eyes and pretty sure there's, you know, it's something it's like to be her. So I'd be pretty confident that was even in the earliest days of humanity, something that they recognized. You know, they didn't think it's just another rock or a tree, right? These things were animated, that you can see that running through into animism and other ideas too. So again, it's an ancient idea, but as I did with the naturalism stuff, you can even go further than that. And so, well, you know, aren't the roots of morality really, again, long before philosophy, even pre-human, because non-human animals of at least certain species, you know, the mother cares for the offspring and vice versa. And isn't that the root of some form of compassion? And we know through natural history that, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that's universal, but it certainly can break across species boundaries in some circumstances as well. So to bring it back to a question, how does this lead you to think about, I guess, dog morality and shadows morality? And what are if such a thing exists, what is that? And are there things we can learn from it?
I'll respond initially with another dim light bulb sort of moment. So I was traveling in northern India. This would have been in about 84, something like that. And I was up in the mountains, and near this village was a troop of monkeys. I think rhesus monkeys, probably. And there was a dog that used to hang out with the monkeys. I used to see the monkey stroking it and patting its ribs, you know, like humans did. So I think possibly in that moment there was a kind of a dim aha kind of, oh, well, what's going on there, you know? This seems to be very human in certain respects. But the idea that morality is not restricted to humans, I think it's one of those philosophical issues, and philosophical issues tend to die a certain death, right? And the death is the death of equivocation, basically. So suppose you ask, well, can animals be moral? As I once did, and I wrote a book about it, you know, and the spoiler alert, yes, they can. So what you end up with ultimately are different conceptions of what it is to act to act morally. So what I think is fair to call the dominant conception, right, is it's a conception shared by people as otherwise diverse as Kant and Aristotle, you know, disagreed on pretty much everything in ethics, apart from this. And the idea is, well, in order to behave morally, you need to be able to reflect on your motivations. So you have to be able to think thoughts like, well, I'm inclined to do this. Is this an inclination I should resist, or is it an inclination I should embrace? So you have to be able to reflect on and how do you answer this question? Will you bring to bear your favorite moral principles? If you're a utilitarian, well, you know, will this inclination, if I act on it, increase the overall amount of happiness in the world, or something like that? right? If you're a Kantian, then you'll bring different principles to bear. Is it compatible with the categorical imperative? All that sort of stuff. But the general kind of model, though, is more general than those specific moral principles. The basic idea is, in order to act morally, you have to be able to scrutinize your motivations, reflect on and scrutinize your motivations. And I'm reasonably sure dogs don't do that, for example. I'm reasonably sure animals don't think them so well. I'm inclined to help this creature in distress. Is this an inclination I should resist, or is it? I don't think they do that. But there is another way of understanding moral behavior that's associated with the Scottish philosopher David Hume, among others. And the basic idea is that you act morally when you have emotions, and these emotions are about or take the other's well-being as their object. So, for example, I first started thinking about this consistently when I became a father at the ripe old age of 44. And I was a bit worried about how the sort of, the new house sharing arrangements were going to work, because my new son would be sharing a house with Nina, who was an old and distinctly cantankerous German Shepherd Malamute mix, and Tess, who was a wolf hybrid who had some. It was very sweet, but had some quite noticeable sort of predatory instincts. But it turned out that they turned out to be better parents than me. If my son so much as squeaked in the middle of the night, then these two cold noses would be pressed against my face. Wake up, you negligent father, your son needs you. And what I think explains it. So what's interesting is that they were distressed by his distress. But it's a distress that takes a specific form, right? Because if you're distressed, like sort of the baby on the plane kind of distress, oh, this baby's crying again. It's people don't like that. But if that was what was going on with the dogs, then they could have alleviated their distress simply by moving to a quieter part of the house.
Yeah.
Right. So
put the noise cancelling earphones in when you're on the plane. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, this in this sort of case, you might say that you're distressed. The dogs were distressed because the baby's distressed, right? But there was more going on. There was more going on in that case because of this, because it elicited helping behavior. They didn't just want to escape what was distressing them. They wanted to stop the distress itself. So we might say that the dogs were distressed that the baby was distressed. Once you have that kind of emotion, so you got distress that takes the distress of another as its object, what it's about, right? Then I think you have the basis of moral emotions, emotions that typically elicit helping behavior because they're about the distress of another. They're not simply because of the distress of another, they're about the distress of the other. So if you're distressed that the baby's, if the dogs are distressed that the baby's distressed, they can't alleviate their distress simply by moving away to a quieter part of the house, right? Because as long as they know that out of sight is not out of mind, and no animal is going to survive very long if it doesn't know that, then that's not going to alleviate their distress because they're distressed that the baby's distressed. So they have a moral emotion whose content is the distress of the babies. That's the basic idea. And so this gives you another way of understanding what moral behavior is. Well, you have emotions which take as their object or their intentional content the well-being of another. And so what happens with the question of can animals be moral? It turns into a fight between the sort of Aristotelian Kantian reflective view of moral behavior and the Humean, more visceral, emotive view. And I think actually, the Kantian Aristotelian view is not very plausible at all. But that's my view. But at the same time, I recognize the futility in philosophy of trying to convince people who have spent a lot of time thinking in these terms of the error of their ways. So ultimately, I think the safest thing you can do is just say, look, can animals be moral? Well, there are different ways of behaving morally, and animals can certainly behave moral in some of those ways. And I think, as a matter of fact, the way that animals are moral coincides with the way humans are moral most of the time. This scrutiny of motivations, I think, is a very rare phenomenon that probably when something has gone seriously wrong.
Yeah. So much more of our, we might pretend to be super reflective, but much more of our human morality is driven by the same dog-style morality too, right? So
I think that's right. I think that's undeniable, actually, though. It's being undeniable. It doesn't stop a lot of people from denying it.
Yeah, of course. Desperate to be different, aren't we? Desperate to be different. So one area where I do think there's a challenge around that sort of dog-style morality, and I think it's a problem within humans as well, where reflection really is useful, is in the question of moral scope. Because if our morality is grounded in empathy and love and, those around us who care for each other, that can be really rich and powerful. But it's not normally that great for those who are outside of that scope. So whether it's, shadows, behavior towards iguanas, or Luna's behavior towards squirrels, or, in-group humans' behavior towards out-group humans, all of these beings can be deeply moral in one context, but then disregard valid moral patience or discriminate against them or harm them in others. So I guess that's one area where I would sort of come back to, let's not throw out the reflection, because I think reflection is one of the things that can really help us with that scope, assuming we do want to have consistent, coherent moral views, and we want to assess other entities to work out if they do have interests or not. But
yeah, no, that's right. And I think one way, if animals can be moral, then they can be moral without having explicit moral principles. So being moral require those. But as you point out, I think it's clearly true, that having explicit moral principles sometimes does help a lot. But it doesn't alter the fact of something being moral, something acting morally, though. It just means that their morality is likely to be questionable in certain respects, like it is for most humans, actually.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, there's one other theme I thought of, which might be a bit of a tangent, but I thought I'd ask you about it, is you can almost go even further when thinking about, is an entity, is a being moral or not? And you can always take it to another level of extreme, where you can almost say, and many people are led to this route through a sort of naturalistic understanding of the world that questions ideas like agency and free will and, the ability to reflect, and ultimately says, well, all of those things are really just physics operating. Maybe free will itself and agency itself, they are illusory things that we reify in inappropriate ways. And there's a philosopher called Aaron Rabinowitz who's just written his thesis on this idea of luck pilling, which is, ultimately everything is luck all the way down, including our biology, our upbringing, our history, everything, right? So in that context, Shadow can't really be blamed for chasing the iguanas. Luna can't be blamed for chasing the squirrels, and I can't be blamed even if I do something terrible to my fellow humans. There's no sort of perfect desert or blame that's warranted. And many people will worry that approach just sort of destroys any conception of justice whatsoever. But actually, where people take it is normally in a much more progressive view. And I wrote a piece on the Sentientism.info website called Sentientist Justice, where I just did a thought experiment of saying, well, imagine that agency and free will, you just put them to one side. What sort of justice system might you have? And it leads you to a position where you say, well, I'm not actually interested in assessing whether an entity has free will or agency or not, right? It might be a whirlwind or a landslide or a natural disaster or a human being or a non-human animal. I'm not really interested in blaming them or,
Precisely.
And then leading to a retributive justice as a result of that. They've done something bad, therefore they deserve to be hurt. But it does leave all of the other justice levers still there, because instead of saying, I want to punish them, you just want to make a better world. And that includes, restoration and rehabilitation and education and deterrence and, all the other stuff that might lead you to say, you've done something terrible, Marc, and we might still want to lock you up in prison to protect your potential future victims and to rehabilitate you. But I wouldn't want to needlessly hurt you because you deserve to be hurt. So again, I'm rambling, but can you go even further into that?
Yeah, no, this is exactly the right question, actually, because one thing you have to do if you want to take seriously the idea that animals can be moral, one distinction you have to make very clearly is that between the evaluation of an agent and the evaluation of motivations. So here's an example. Take the philosopher's standard example of a very bad human being, say Hitler, right? Now, suppose Hitler lives in what we can call hard determinism world, right? Um, Perhaps hard determinism world is this world. We don't really know, right? But hard determinism world is a world where everything is determined, everything is inevitable, and therefore people can't be held responsible for what they do. There's nothing they could do to change anything. Now, in that world, we might want to say we can't evaluate Hitler, right? Because he had no say, no choice in what he did. It was all inevitable. But it doesn't follow from this that we can't morally evaluate his motivations, right? Sending 6 million people to the gas chambers, that's a morally evil motivation. So the motivation can be assessed, morally speaking, even if the person can't be assessed, morally speaking. Because
its potential to create future harm can be assessed in the same light, and that would warrant you doing something about it. Right? Yeah,
that would be one aspect of it. Yeah. So we can't because we don't want to go back to a situation. We don't want to go back to a situation of, say, legal trials for animals as they had in earlier times. When some poor pig eats turnips from the wrong farmer's field, they get hauled up before the magistrate. I take it everyone would think that's silly. So what we need is a logical space, right, where motivations can be assessed, even if the actors can't. So I talk to animals as moral subjects. What this means is they have moral motivations, which can be good or bad, but they themselves can't be assessed as good or bad. So moral subject was supposedly a sort of a part of logical space between moral patients on the one hand and moral agents on the other. So moral agents can be assessed for what they do. So animals are not moral agents in that sense, but they are moral subjects in the sense that they're motivated to act by emotions that take the well-being of another as their object.
Yeah, thank you. Now, to wrap up this question of who matters, I wanted to get your thoughts on going beyond sentience, if you like, as a qualifier for moral patiency, because you can almost imagine this sort of the classic sliding scale is like anthropocentrism, sentiocentrism, biocentrism, where you care about living entities even if they're not sentient, and ultimately ecocentrism or holism, where you care about entire ecosystems and the things within them, whether or not they're even living. And I know you've written about the environmental crisis, and that's one of those priorities and problems that leads many people to go beyond sentientism or sentiocentrism. And in fact, I think the first couple of times the word sentientism were used was not by people promoting it. It was actually as a criticism by biocentrists and ecocentrists who were saying, look, you're discriminating against the non-sentient natural world, right? So you're just introducing. So what do you think about moral scope going beyond sentience, whatever sentience is? Do you do that instrumentally, intrinsically, or something else?
Nowadays, I'm more inclined to I think the clearest case of the clearest argument you can give for extending moral consideration beyond humans appeals to sentience. I don't know of any similarly, I think the argument is very convincing, but I don't know of any similarly convincing argument that tries to, base it on biocentrism or ecocentrism or things like that. I think anything you get from that, you can probably get from instrumental conception, where its impact on creatures that are sentient. That's the important thing. So in general, I'd say it's tricky to do that, and it's not something we need to do anyway. So let's not bother.
I mean, that's very much my view. I share a rich concern for their environment, but it is only because of its impact on all the sentient beings, human and not. And in a way, I don't mind if people genuinely want to go beyond sentientism to biocentrism and ecocentrism. But one of my frequent rants on this podcast is that many of the people who claim to have an expansive biocentric or ecocentric stance actually still exclude vast numbers of obviously sentient beings from their moral consideration in practical terms. So it gives the lie to their biocentrism and ecocentrism. And often what they are is just another veneer on anthropocentrism, right? And you dig down and say, well, why do you care about the environment? Ultimately, it's I want ecosystem services and I want nature to look pretty. And,
yes, no,
and I'm like, well, okay, you're not really an ecocentrist, right? You just come back to it in human interest, right? If you can describe why you care about these things without referring to human interests, I might listen. But otherwise, you're just stuck with anthropocentrism. So,
yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. Actually, I think you identified the two main moves that people make. One is a sort of instrumental; it collapses into an instrumentalism, or it collapses into a sort of aesthetic view, which I think is difficult to defend, really.
Well, maybe we should come on to the final big question before I let you go, which is, how do we make a better world? So given we've sort of roughly got a sort of epistemology and we've got a moral scope that at least includes all of the beings we think are, likely to be sentient, that stance to me feels very intuitive and quite compelling. And in fact, it is to many humans. Many humans also, well, of course I want to believe based on evidence and reason. And of course, all beings that have the capacity to have experiences and suffer matter, of course, right? It's only when you explain the implications that people start to object because there are beliefs they desperately want to hold on to that they don't want to let go of that are poorly founded. And there are practices and things they've come to think are socially normal that go against the minimal moral baseline that you laid out earlier on in very egregious ways. And so it's a strange sort of setup because, like I said, it feels intuitive, but when you use it to look at the world as honestly as we can, you see, maybe quadrillions of potentially sentient beings living free-ranging in the wild. You see maybe, 2 to 3 trillion highly likely sentient beings exploited and killed every year by human beings for largely trivial ends. You see the companion animals in our homes, they're in a different light as you and I have come to do. And you look at the 8 billion humans, regardless of all of their characteristics. So one, it's sort of quite shocking to look at the world with those eyes because you've got so many more moral patients you might have thought of before. And although the way of thinking seems intuitive, it clashes brutally with nearly all of the dominant social norms around the world. So in that context, how do you think we can go about making a better world? Because I think there's almost a couple of different questions. One is, how do we make a better world? And another one is, what's the meaning of life? And I'm not sure if those two things are totally independent and orthogonal or whether they're richly intertwined. And you've written richly on both. So I don't know where you want to go from there. You can talk about a utopian vision or something more pragmatic and prosaic, or how those two things relate if they do.
Yeah. Well, I think the easiest thing to do when we're talking about a better world is to appeal to human self-interest, because that's far more effective than appealing to morality or logic, right? So we have to. These are things we know, right? We know now that the baseline global climate is roughly 1.5 degrees C above what it was in pre-industrial times. We know from previous great extinctions that if we get to 10 degrees C, then we should expect, it's not clear, but we should expect extinction rates of 90 to 95%. Last time temperatures went 10% higher. That's the sort of thing that happened. It's not to say it will happen this time, but it seems to be a sort of default assumption that we should probably make. So we need to seriously address these issues. I think animals, our treatment of animals is at the heart of everything we do environmentally. We have no hope unless we fundamentally change the way we interact with animals. In particular, we can't afford to eat them anymore. That was a different time. So here's the situation I think we find ourselves in. We're hoping that society doesn't fall apart. We want to try and save society in something like a recognizable form, something recognizably similar to what we have. Whatever recognizably similar means, that's not as straightforward as it seems, maybe. We know we can't go on burning fossil fuels because the climate ramifications will be too serious. So we know if we're going to continue to use them, then we need to develop carbon capture and sequestration technology, which at the moment doesn't exist, and is very energetically expensive if it can be made viable. So there's a thing called fuel sources are often assessed in something called EROI. It's the energy returned on the energy invested. Okay. So you find a seam of coal, for example, and if you burn it, this will release a certain amount of energy. But to get at the coal, you have to get people to go in and dig it out and so on, and that will require the investment of a certain amount of energy. So the EROI is the amount of energy you get out of the coal divided by the amount of energy you had to put in to get it. So most indications are that most estimates, right? And I think the estimates may need a bit of work, but most estimates say in order to maintain a society, recognizably similar to the one we have now, we need fuel sources with EROIs in the region of 14 to 25 to 1. So we need anywhere between 14 and 25 times as much energy out of our fuel sources as we put into getting. Right. The problem is that standard, fossil fuels, their EROI is declining anyway. It's around about the 25 to 1 figure now globally, because of all these difficulties in sort of attaining the sources. It used to be 100 to 1. Now it's diminished. If we try to make them climate friendly, we need to employ carbon capture and sequestration technology, which reduces, because it's so energetic. I mean, think of what's involved in sort of stripping the carbon dioxide out of things. First of all, you've got to collect it, but then it's in a gaseous form. You can't. So what you have to do then is turn it into liquid, which involves compression or cooling or both. And then you have to store it in metal canisters. Then you have to transport it to somewhere where you can safely dispose of it, which there aren't any places really that are unproblematic. So this is not likely to work. What will happen, and this I think is the best case scenario, if we employ the strategy, then the EROI of our fossil fuels will drop so low that they won't be viable anymore. On the other hand, the EROI of nuclear was always kind of on the cusp of viability. Didn't scream out, oh yeah, this is going to work. But the same is true of fossil fuels. Their EROIs, the lower estimates make them useless, higher estimates make them okay, mid-range estimates put them on the cusp of viability too. So I think what we have to do, given this is the situation with our fuel sources, we need to seriously address the way we look at another source of energy, which is the animals we eat, where the EROIs are upside down. I mean, you have to put in roughly 50 times as much energy to get the same amount of energy out of a certain quantity of beef, for example. So the EROIs are
the waste is absolutely incredible. And in fact, I think it's one thing. There's a strange taboo against challenging animal agriculture in environmental spaces, but the facts that really, putting the ethics aside completely, that really drive that home for me are exactly as you're saying, the feed conversion ratios and the sheer amount of waste of that basic process as you go through the trophic chains. People worry about supermarkets throwing out wonky vegetables, but they completely ignore the 90 to 95% waste of the, edible food products being fed to animals. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's right. And according to a mid-range estimate made by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, animal agriculture is responsible for 14.5% of global emissions. So you get rid of that, you take that those sorts of numbers out. It gives you time to develop, because renewable technologies are much newer than this nuclear or fossil fuel technology. So we can legitimately expect, and given the way technology works, we can legitimately expect certain improvements. How much, we're not sure, but some improvements. Take animals out of the picture, and then you have huge swathes of land.
Yeah, mind blowing, like continents worth, isn't it?
Yeah, billions and billions of hectares, that you can now use for afforestation, growing forests where there haven't been any recently, which...
Because that's a sequestration technology that does actually work.
It's the only one that works, yes. It's the only one that works. So I think that's what we've got to do. We need this land to cool the planet, and therefore we can't afford to put animals on it to eat
So in a way, your route to addressing the horror of animal agriculture is to, use the, human self-interest and fear of what climate change will do to drive. And do you think some people are in the animal movement are frustrated with that story because what they, what we all in a way would love is for all humans to go through some deep ethical transformation and to, see what we see and act differently, right? And I feel the pull of that very strongly as well. So there's a frustration that we're having to use a different motive to get to the end. And I feel that pull, but I also worry about it because our concern should be for the victims, not for how I feel about, someone else being virtuous individually, right? So to my mind, I'm like, well, whatever it takes. But part of the reason those people are worried is because they think it might be a sort of ethical bypassing, where if we don't go through the ethical transformation, we'll find some other egregious horror to do in the future when we've managed to, find some form of new animal agriculture. Or and I think it might work the other way around, where once we're freed of the social norms of animal agriculture and exploitation, it will actually free us up to embody and put into practice our latent, suppressed, compassionate, sentiocentric ethics. And maybe it could actually accelerate the ethical transformation when people are no longer complicit in something they know deep down is actually horrific. What do you think there's either of those is a more realistic path, or is it just about, I don't care, let's just push?
I suspect, if I understand you correctly, I'm probably a more jaded person than you are.
Yeah.
I've written, I can't remember how many books now on animal rights. Have any of them done any good? Have any of them persuaded anyone who wasn't already persuaded? I don't know. I'm not sure they have. So I'm inclined to think that
I'm sure they have. I'm sure there's been many who've been
I don't
nudged at least. Yeah.
Possibly. I mean, it's unclear. I suspect that self-interest is more motivational than doing the right thing, and it turns out that I think probably the right thing would be to have vast parts of the planet where humans are just not allowed to go. We just leave the animal. I mean, in a world where supposedly, according to estimates of Phillips, Milo, and Barron, you see those estimates, the biomass estimates. So you get a biomass calculation by multiplying the weight of an average creature of a species by the number of creatures in that species, individuals in that species. So according to their calculations, I don't know if they're right, but according to their calculations, 96% of mammalian biomass on the planet now is made up of either humans or animals that humans eat, that we farm or do eat. 70% of avian biomass is made up of fowl that we eat.
It's mind-blowing.
When you think of, say, the world at the end of the last major ice age, 14,000 years ago, is just a fantastic bestiary of just incredible creatures. And what we did was we came along and we kind of relocated the biomass. We took it from all these fantastic animals, Eurasian lions, dire wolves, giant sloths. We just took their biomass and we put it into us and animals we like to eat. And the world is just a poorer place for it, in my view, right? So I think we're like ungrateful children, and we need to be kept away from most of the world. So my what I would advocate is just vast old forests, covering as much of the globe as we can cover, and humans just being forced to stay away.
Yeah, contain ourselves. Yeah. Well, thank you. The final question I'll ask before I let you go is about this, making the world better versus finding meaning in life. So I guess a caricature of the literature and the thinking about finding meaning of life might be the sort of self-help genre. And to me, so much of that writing and thinking is understandably and with value focused on making my world better, right? It's like about how I can feel better, how I can feel meaning, how I can, and a lot of the thinking in that space doesn't seem particularly morally expansive to me, for example. So, if you skim through all of the stuff about Stoicism, for example,
right.
It seems to be very centered on how I feel and how, how I can cope with stuff. and doesn't really engage that richly with how to be a good person in the wider world, and certainly doesn't question the anthropocentric moral scope at all. I don't know if you've got any closing thought about how, the meaning of my life and making my world better can or should link to making the world better for ultimately all of the other sentient beings. How much overlap is there, or are they distinct problems?
Yeah, but I suspect they're distinct, and the intuition that underlies that is the idea that even horrible people can have meaningful lives.
So in a way, meaning is an amoral concept.
I suspect it is. I mean, it's not because, I suspect it is. It's not because sometimes the meaning of life is put. I mean, Camus famously put, well, why not commit suicide? The fundamental question of philosophy is suicide, Camus thought. But it's not clear exactly how this translates into a question about the meaning of life. So is it simply, well, what makes life worth living? Well, your life can be made worth living by lots of things that are just, other people would say, are not worth it at all, Or is it that you should focus on the things that should make life worth living? But then the problem is we don't understand what should means. I don't think it's a moral should, because as I say, I think horrible people can have meaningful lives. Until the other hand, Genghis Khan, morally very questionable, but their lives were arguably sort of meaningful, So I don't think it's a moral issue at all.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe we should be a bit more dog-like when we're thinking about how to make our lives better, but we still need some reflection if we're going to make the world a better place. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe that's the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's been a joy to speak to you. I think the first time I came across your work was when something else my audience might be interested in was your extension of the veil of ignorance idea to non-human animals and so on, which is another example of that sort of brilliant, very simple, but ultimately quite radical moral thinking. So thank you for that too. So it's been wonderful to talk to you. What's the best way of people following you, buying your book, keeping up to date with the work you do? I don't think you do much social media, do you? You're a wiser man than me.
I don't seem to do any now. I just don't have time. So no, if anyone is interested in my books, they can be found where most places books are sold. I think whatever your favorite book place is.
Yeah, I will include some links in the show notes too. Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for writing The Word of Dog, and thank you from Luna too. You're going to say goodbye before we go?
Bye, Luna. You're a very good girl.
I think she enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, Marc. Please do stay in touch. Thanks for being a guest on Sentientism.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.